make men holy. Let us die to make men free. While God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The highest praise is glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
The effects of the civil rights movement were demonstrated by the success of the protests in Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama. Yet this was only the beginning of a movement that spanned nearly 2 decades, ending abruptly with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Today's show will highlight many important events during the civil rights era and will speak to how this era set the tone for the movements that followed.
When one analyzes the modern civil rights movement, many scholars now spend time helping citizens and students to appreciate the events of Montgomery, Alabama in the mid-50s. But we really ought to spend a greater amount of time appreciating some special cities like Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee, and the students at Fisk University and the students at Tennessee State in Nashville responded to the first sit-ins that occurred on February the 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. They responded almost immediately. And one of the most important people that comes out of that Nashville movement was a woman named Diane Nash. Diane Nash would later become, in the year 1960, one of the founders of the SNCC organization. And the students who founded SNCC, and SNCC stood for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That group that had one of its strongest chapters, led by Diane Nash at Fisk and Tennessee State in 1960s, they engaged in some crucial movement activities. It's out of that Nashville movement in 1960 that the first real protest march in the South occurs. And once Diane Nash and the other black students at Fisk and Tennessee State in 1960 engage in this dignified protest march that included more than 3,000 individuals, then a new tactic begins to be adopted by African Americans throughout the movement days of the 1960s. And Diane Nash is underappreciated. She's almost as important from a scholarly point of view as a Rosa Parks, as a Fanny Lou Hamer, as so many other women who were principals in the 1960s. And if she had never done another thing after the movement in the Nashville city in 1960, she'd still be appreciated by scholars, serious students of the civil rights movement. But Diane Nash went on to do several additional things. She was a movement activist in deep Mississippi. She came to the rescue of those who had been attacked in Anniston, Alabama, when the Freedom Riders were attacked by the Ku Klux Klan in North Alabama in 1961. She insisted publicly that the Freedom Rides continue. Indeed, Diane Nash went on to be a significant contributor to the SNCC activities throughout the 1960s. Unfortunately, she was pushed further and further to the background by legendary leaders like Stokely Carmichael, who had real problems with sexism, by others who thought that the only place for a woman in the movement in the 60s was prone, meaning that they only saw women as sexual objects. So women like Diane Nash are really the kind of contributors that scholars like myself and others recognize now as being some of the most important American contributors to the change and transformation that the nation was going through in the 1960s. The Nashville movement was really important, and that helped to give tremendous impetus to students around the nation to the idea that it could be indeed a student movement. And that's an important opening up in America in the 1960s to the ideas that students could make a difference. It helps to fuel later the anti-war protest that would be so important to changing America in the 1960s.
During the Civil Rights Movement, I would say the next institution in terms of importance to that movement would be the black colleges, second only to the black churches. Because within the black colleges, you had all of these young people who were learning about black history, black culture, but who also were idealistic, as young people tend to be, and who wanted to bring about change. And so when the Civil Rights Movement came along, they were able to mobilize folk within those black colleges, young people. One of the very important challenges for young people today is to recognize that in 1960, the Civil Rights Movement was largely headed by older black folk, adults within the black community. Now, many of those adults were young. King was only 26 years old when he came to prominence in Montgomery, Alabama. But many of the black leaders within that movement were certainly, middle-aged folk, adults. In 1960, black students throughout the South in black colleges decided that they were going to step out front and engage themselves in the movement to overthrow Jim Crow. And they then organized sit-in demonstrations throughout the South that spread rapidly within 2 months. And that movement took off like it had never done before because of the mass participation of young black people. Now, within the colleges, the historically black colleges and universities. Now, what does that say? That says that these young people at that time decided that it was not just about them getting an education and then being able to get good jobs and good homes and fancy automobiles and to acquire status, to become prominent and that sort of thing. What they decided was that it was much more important to them at that time to overthrow the oppression that hampered the lives of the community itself. So they went to jail. They were risking their futures by going to jail and so on. They were risking their lives. But the bottom line then is that here is another wing of the movement that emerged in the 1960s. It's the young people's wing. It's the student wing. And they made a choice that at the time they did not know it, of course, but it had national and international significance. In 1960, they decided that they would not become a part of the adult civil rights organizations, but that they would build their own organization. And therefore, they organized SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so they organized their own social change movement. So this is an organization of students to participate in protest activities, to organize a movement to overthrow Jim Crow. That was a momentous decision. And immediately what that did, of course, is that it said to white students, my God, these students aren't just sitting around talking about change. They are actually engaged in activities to bring about social change. And they've organized their own social movement organization to bring about change. And so then the white students in the North were inspired, and a significant number of them joined the civil rights movement because of them seeing what black students did. And not only that, they organized their own social movement organization called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Students for a Democratic Society was actually modeled after SNCC.
In 1959, in the South, in Dixie we call it, in the 11 states of the old Confederate, all restaurants and theaters were segregated, and once you rode buses, you had to get on the back. And so we were studying nonviolence under Jim Lawson, the student at Vanderbilt, who was also a field secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And he was teaching us about Gandhi. And then in 1960, sit-ins took place in Raleigh, North Carolina, not Raleigh, Greensboro, North Carolina. And so they said, well, could y'all support us, send us money? We said, no, our best support is to carry on a simultaneous demonstration. We will send you some resources to help you, but a greater help would be for us to execute a movement in Nashville. But we were already in training, and had been so all that fall in the nonviolent workshops with Jim Lawson. So then we organized the sit-in movement using the Gandhi's principles of nonviolence. And that is predicated upon you accepting the tenet that Gandhi set forth. One is that oppression is not superimposed, it's self-induced. That you are oppressed because you go along with it. That the problem has to do with your being the problem. So stop being the problem and you start being the solution. Take your investment out of the problem and then advocate a new relationship and a solution. And it took about 40, 50 days to get that done. And it happened so quick and so easy. It's like, well, this may have been a fluke. Let's try it again. So let's test the theaters. So when we organized SNCC later that year down in Raleigh, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Shaw University, our first project, we said, okay, what we will do as students, when we go back next year, because we had students from all over the South, Nashville, Memphis, Jackson, New Orleans, Atlanta, every black college in the South basically had students at that conference. So we said, now what we will do is in February the 1st, to celebrate the sit-in movement, we will all start an open theater movement. We were the only movement, Nashville group, to go back and get started. The rest of them didn't. And just before Mother's Day, Friday before Mother's Day, we negotiated the open theaters in Nashville. So Nashville, Friday before Mother's Day, all the theaters was open. So we was like celebrating. So now we've done two things. We opened the theaters and we'd open the restaurants. Then that Sunday, Mother's Day, CORE was doing a freedom ride from New York to New Orleans. And when the bus got to Anniston, Alabama, it was burned on Mother's Day. And so CORE said, it's too dangerous, we'll call it off. And we said in Nashville, no, we will call it back on. So Diane Nash asked me, I was the chairman, to call a meeting so we could discuss it. So I called a meeting and we discussed it. And we voted that we would continue the freedom ride. And she called Jim Farmer and asked him, was it all right? He said, yeah, it's all right, but it's just too dangerous. I don't recommend it. And we said, no, we take all liability. So we kept the freedom ride going. Of course, later he joined back into the freedom ride, and we stayed in jail all that spring and later that summer. And by November, the ICC, the Interstate Commission, had ruled that segregation in public facilities were no longer constitutional and lawful. So that's how that all went down. So they had opened restaurants in the 60s, opened the theaters in 61. and ended segregation on buses in '61. And these were basically student movements.
And so we began the civil rights movement, which was built on earlier struggles. It did not start December 2nd, 1955. It started with my dad and mama left Alabama and other places, along with the people in Arkansas who stayed there and organized and sweated and took it. It started all over. In the hearts and minds, it started with our ancestors who said, I'm tired. I can't do anything, but I got to pass on something. So we began then the civil rights. They began. I was a part of it. Struggle which carried us from Montgomery to many other counties in Birmingham, young people in Mississippi, organizing a student for nonviolent, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Corps, which I had been a part of helping organize with Jim Farmer here in Chicago in 1941. I got a tape of Archibald Carey talking about that period that we organized the Corps, Congress of Racial Equality, church at 64th and Evans, where my mother and father were members, and Reverend Carey was the pastor. And we got caught up in the army. The Corps was mostly white at that time. Jim Farmer was a student at the University of Chicago, and I was a curious hanger-on. I'm kind of that's where I am. I mean, I hear something, I like it, I think I'll go take part in it. But then we all got drafted, and then when they returned, most of the guys and gals in the earlier Corps had moved to New York. That's where they were from. So a new Corps started, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee started with Bennett Johnson in North Carolina. I mean, they went to North Carolina to help organize it. Bennett Johnson, who lives in Evanston now, has been a publisher of a newspaper, and is a publisher, has been a publisher of a book, Path Press. Former Congressman Gus Savage and others. I didn't go to North Carolina for that event, I'm sorry to say. And that was where they caught up with people like the now prominent Reverend Jesse Jackson and others who were very much a part of that beginning of SNCC. And SNCC then embraced many whites who wanted to do something in their own way. And then later, Whit Stokely, who was a fantastic guy, I don't know whether you ever met him. He's a fantastic guy. And I guess I say that because he liked me, and that made him all right. but he was a brilliant guy, a lot of courage. He became disillusioned with the whites in SNCC, so he asked him to leave. And that was when another organization came to me, because they didn't know where to go. It came to me and said, "Where we go?" I said, "Well, form your own organization." And out of some of those thoughts came the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, which was a radical white, middle-class white group.
And it's important to note that when you look at the African American movement of the 60s, the federal laws of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they've expanded the literal human rights of all members of this society. Mexican Americans in a city like Chicago that can now use bilingual ballots owe a debt to the black folks who put their lives on the line in Selma, Alabama, because it's that voting rights law of 1965 that also pioneered bilingual ballots, so that when Chinese in the city of San Francisco can get a ballot that is in Mandarin or Cantonese, they should also be aware that that's a legacy of the black civil rights movement. When women are able to join men in the boardrooms of corporate America, they should be appreciative of the fact that affirmative action has produced more results for white women than it has for black people. And too few of them recognize that it was often black blood and black sweat that produced the kinds of pressure that produced affirmative action programs in the late 60s that so many women, including those sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court, now enjoy and sometimes take for granted. So once again, we learn the American lesson that African American struggle produces positive results for literally every single citizen in this nation. And it's not just a slogan, it's a reality. And all one has to do is to look at the law and look at the long-term positive results of those various laws.
And of course, another thing I think is very important about the civil rights movement is that it was not simply a black movement, is that it was not a movement that was geared only toward liberating black people, is that it was a movement that was concerned about oppression, poverty, and inequality generally. Is that the civil rights movement, when I was talking about nonviolent direct action, is that the civil rights movement actually inspired and generated all of the movements that we talk about now that came out of the 1960s, the modern women's movement, the farm workers movement, the environmental movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the disability movement. All of those movements were inspired by the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement generated all of these tactics for social change. When we talk about nonviolent direct action, once again, those tactics and so forth were embraced and adopted by all of these other groups and so on. And so then, at the apex of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s, King and other leaders had to confront the problem of economic inequality head on. And so what King was doing at that point is that he was in the process of building a multiracial coalition of poor folk, Appalachian whites, Mexican Americans, farm workers, labor groups, all into a coalition to go and to confront the federal government in Washington, D.C. about poverty and economic inequality. In fact, the logic is that in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama, Selma, in Mississippi, throughout the South, the real power of the civil rights movement was this, in terms of nonviolent direct action, is that nonviolent direct action meant that you had to precipitate a breakdown in social order. That in places like Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, that the only way that you could generate change is that you had to create such social disorder that the city could not function as usual. And so that the economic engine of the city would be halted, commerce and so forth, that social order itself would cease to exist. And that's exactly what they did through sit-ins, marches, going to jail literally by the thousands. The whole city was brought to a halt. It could not function. Northern capitalists who actually controlled many of the businesses in Birmingham looked up and said, oh my goodness, we can't invest in these corporations in Birmingham, Alabama, because there's just too much uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. You can't make any money in that situation. And then so once nonviolent direct action was able to cause such disruption that it halted the actions of the city, then that created the leverage on which the leaders of the movement then would go in to say, we will restore order if you agree to these changes, if you agree to our demands. And so it was no longer, would you please allow us this? Would you please think about it and do this because it's right to do? No, now what they were saying is that we now have power, we now have leverage. This city cannot function anymore until we decide to call off demonstrations, until we allow calm to be restored. And we will not allow any sort of calmness and social order to be restored if you do not capitulate to our demands. That was the power of nonviolent direct action.
Righteous sentence.